It all started with a will that didn't make sense. Iris was 67, done with the noise of other people's problems. Then her sister died, and everything she thought she'd buried with the past came clawing back to life. The house wasn't just hers to inherit, it came with a condition that made no damn sense. Live in it for 1 year, but not alone. Live in it with 3 women from high school she hadn't spoken to in 40 years. A judge, a nun, and a woman who once tattooed a skull over her ex-husband's name. It should have been a disaster. But one photograph, one voice from the grave, one secret by the lake, and everything changed. Stay with me, because by the time this story ends, you're going to realize it was never about the house at all. But before we begin, write in the comments where you're from. I'm curious to see how far these stories can travel. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new captivating tales. Let's begin. The letter came the morning after the funeral, slid under Iris Montgomery's door like a blade slipped between ribs, silent and cold. She had barely taken off her black dress, hadn't even tossed the withered rose from the casket into the trash, when she unfolded the heavy cream paper and felt her hands tremble for the first time in years. No one should have been able to shake her like that anymore, not after the divorce, the chemotherapy, the long nights alone with bourbon and boxed macaroni. But there it was, in the cold legal ink of her dead sister's lawyer: you may inherit the house on Laurel Creek, but only under the following conditions. She had to live in it, not sell, not rent, not tear it down for peace of mind, with 3 women from her high school graduating class, for 1 full year. No early exits. No substitutions. No exceptions. And those 3 names were etched there like ghosts returning for unfinished business: Judith Carol Bennett, Dolores Lolly Jameson, Maeve Devlin. She sat down hard in the old kitchen chair, the one with the split cushion and wobbling leg, and stared at the letter as if it might catch fire on its own. Her sister, cold in the ground less than 24 hours, was still managing to make her life a living riddle. Judith had become a federal judge, last Iris heard, the kind who wore her sternness like a black robe even off the bench. Lolly had vanished years ago after a failed marriage and some rumored religious calling. Last known address was a convent outside Tucson. Maeve? Maeve was the wild one, the kind of woman who could burn bridges while laughing, the kind you forgave too late. And now, somehow, they were all being summoned back like pieces on a forgotten chessboard, locked into some game Iris never agreed to play. She didn't sleep that night, just poured herself too many drinks and replayed arguments from decades ago she thought she'd buried under time and silence. Her sister, Frances, had hated apologies, but this smelled like one to Iris, just twisted in that signature Frances way, always a knife wrapped in velvet. By sunrise, Iris knew she'd say yes, not for the house, not for the legacy, but because the mystery of it all gnawed at her more than the fear. There was something Frances wanted her to see. Something that couldn't be spoken, only lived through. The house stood waiting on Laurel Creek Road, untouched by time but soaked in it, shutters hanging like tired eyelids, porch sagging like an old sigh. She turned the key for the first time in 40 years and felt the breath of memory hit her chest so hard, she had to lean on the doorframe. Inside, everything was as Frances left it: the ticking grandfather clock, the stiff smell of lavender and secrets, the faint creak of the floorboards like the house remembered her footsteps. Iris barely had time to walk through the front parlor when a red truck pulled into the drive and kicked up a storm of dust like Judgment Day come early. Judith Bennett stepped out, still iron-backed and tight-lipped, her silver hair bound like a noose. She didn't offer a hello, just one of those glares that stripped the years off you and made you feel 15 again, caught smoking behind the gym. Before Iris could say anything, a taxi rolled up behind the truck, and out stepped Lolly, still rail-thin, with the same wary eyes she had the day she left school in the middle of sophomore year. Her habit was gone, but the cross around her neck looked heavy with unfinished prayers. Then, just as the sun hit the edge of the trees, came a roar so loud it rattled the windows. A motorcycle. And on it, with a cigarette dangling from her mouth and a grin full of mischief and age, was Maeve Devlin. She parked like she owned the earth, stepped off like time hadn't touched her, and threw her duffel on the porch like it was a casual Friday. 4 women stood in silence. Not a word. Just the weight of 40 years thick in the air, like dust you didn't dare stir. Inside, the air was stale, the furniture older than their grudges, and still, none of them spoke first. Until Maeve flopped into a chair and said, "Well, if this ain't a hell of a haunted house party." Judith's eyes narrowed like they always had before she lowered the gavel. Lolly crossed herself without thinking. And Iris? Iris just stared at the staircase. She remembered something. A moment. A voice. Laughter, from another lifetime, echoing from upstairs. That night, silence filled every room like smoke. No one wanted to be the first to break it. Until the past decided it would speak for them. Maeve found the envelope. Wedged in the back of the fireplace, behind an old brick they'd all carved their initials into during the summer of '74. It had no address. No stamp. Just 4 names. And one sentence, "I know what you did, and I forgive you anyway." Iris read it out loud, and when she finished, Lolly was already crying, Judith had gone pale, and Maeve was staring out the window like someone expecting a ghost. They didn't speak of it again that night. They each drifted to separate rooms like strangers on a train headed for someplace they didn't choose. But long after midnight, Iris sat alone on the porch, chain-smoking and thinking about the boy with the green Camaro, and how none of them ever talked about what happened that night by the lake. She didn't even turn around when Judith's voice came from the shadows behind her, tired, dry, brittle with memory. "Do you think somebody else knows what happened back then?" "Yeah," Maeve said, stepping out onto the porch beside Iris, lighting her own cigarette with a flick that hadn't lost its rhythm. "I think someone's always known. I just don't think they were ready to say it until now." The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It buzzed like a live wire under the floorboards, full of questions that had waited 40 years for air. That morning, Iris awoke to find the attic door wide open, despite swearing she'd locked it herself the night before, and a cold draft crawling down the stairs. At the top step sat an envelope, the same heavy cream stock as the will, but this time with her name, only her name, inked on the front. Inside, a single Polaroid. 4 teenagers. 3 girls in summer dresses and 1 boy in a green varsity jacket, all standing by the dock at Echo Lake. But the 4th girl, the one to the left, her face had been scratched out, gouged by something sharp, like fingernails or regret. And written in bold, block letters across the bottom were 4 words that made Iris sit down before she collapsed: "You were all there." The kitchen felt colder when she came downstairs, like the photo had stolen some of the heat from the house, or maybe from her bones. Maeve was nursing coffee like it owed her rent, Lolly sat clutching a rosary so tight her knuckles were bloodless, and Judith had a newspaper she wasn't reading. Without a word, Iris dropped the Polaroid on the table, and watched 3 faces go from wary to white in a heartbeat. "I don't remember that picture being taken," Lolly said first, though her voice cracked on the word remember like it didn't want to carry the weight. Judith didn't look at the photo, just folded her hands like she was delivering a verdict. "There was only one night we were all at Echo Lake together," she said, "and it was the night Bobby disappeared." Maeve didn't flinch. She just stared at the scratched-out face and said, "He was with Iris when he got into the water." The word stung like an accusation, though the tone didn't mean it that way. It was just the kind of truth that cut without being sharpened. Iris took a shaky breath, trying to remember the details she'd buried so deep they felt like someone else's dream. "He dove in, chasing his keys or something," she whispered. "I never saw him come back up." Judith's voice came harder now, like thunder echoing down a mountain. "But you never called the police." "None of us did, not until 2 days later." Maeve leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "That's because we didn't want them to look too hard, did we?" The table went silent again, and the clock in the hallway ticked loud enough to count the seconds of 40 years unspoken. It wasn't guilt that gripped them now, it was fear. Fear that someone else knew. And worse, that Francis had known all along. Later that day, they found Francis' old trunk in the basement, tucked behind crates of vinyl records and boxes of yellowed tax returns. Inside, they expected to find keepsakes. Instead, they found folders. Each one labeled with a name: Judith, Lolly, Maeve, Iris. Inside each folder were copies of letters, some written by them in high school, some addressed to Bobby Martin, the boy with the green Camaro. But it was the final envelope, plain and sealed, with "Do not open until you're ready to tell the truth," scrawled in Francis' unmistakable hand, that stopped them cold. They didn't open it. Not yet. Not because they weren't curious, but because they all felt the weight of what it might contain, and none of them wanted to be the first to look. Instead, they went outside to the porch, where the evening light touched the trees and the wind reminded them how long it had been since they just sat together in silence. For a moment, it almost felt like healing was possible. Until the sirens came. 2 sheriff cars pulled up the gravel drive, lights flashing but no urgency in the movements. Out stepped a deputy, younger than their own children, with the look of someone carrying a burden he didn't understand. "I'm sorry to bother you folks," he said, eyes flicking from face to face like he already knew who they were. "There's been a development in the Bobby Martin case. We're reopening the investigation based on new information that surfaced from an anonymous source last week." He paused, waiting for a reaction, but none came. They all just stood there, perfectly still, like the past had finally arrived to collect its debt. "Each of you will be asked to provide a statement in the coming days," he added, "but for now, we just need to know one thing." He pulled out a photograph, the same photograph Iris had found that morning, the one with the scratched-out face, and held it up for them to see. "Do any of you know who might have altered this picture?" he asked. Maeve stepped forward, slow but without hesitation, her voice low and sure. "That was Francis," she said. "And if you want to know why, then you're going to have to ask her why she left that envelope for Iris." The deputy frowned, flipping through his notepad, and then looked back up with confusion etched in his young face. "Francis?" he asked. "You mean Francis Montgomery, the homeowner?" Lolly, still clutching her rosary, nodded. "That's right. She died last week." The deputy stared at them like he was seeing ghosts. "Ma'am, that's not possible," he said slowly. "We have record of a Francis Montgomery checking in to St. Luke's Psychiatric Center in Ashbury just 2 days ago. She's still alive." Lolly turned to the others, pale as milk, and whispered, "Then who the hell did we bury?" "I don't know," Iris said, her voice hollow, barely louder than the wind scratching through the screen door behind her. "But whoever it was, Francis wanted it that way. She wanted us to think she was gone so we'd come back here." No one argued. Because now, the question wasn't just about Bobby, or even Grace, it was about why Francis faked her death, and why now. That night, none of them could sleep, so they poured whiskey and spread the folders across the living room floor like war plans. Inside Judith's folder, they found letters, dozens of them, all postmarked from Ashbury, all addressed to Francis, none of which had ever been opened. Each one was written in the same tight, severe script Judith had always used when she wanted control more than she wanted connection. And yet, every line ached with apology, the kind that comes too late and lands like a stone in a dry well. Maeve's folder held sketches, crude, raw, emotional charcoal drawings that had to be at least 40 years old, all showing the same image, a dock, a boy's back, and a splash just beyond him. Each one slightly different, like someone trying to get the memory right but failing every time, haunted by the way the water swallowed him and gave nothing back. Lolly's folder was the worst. It wasn't just prayers or hymns, it was a confession. A full page, written in her own trembling hand, signed and dated the week after Bobby vanished. "I should have stopped him from jumping," it read. "But I didn't, because part of me wanted him to disappear." Iris didn't open her own folder. She let it sit there, untouched, as the others turned to her, waiting for her to break the silence, to lead or explain or confess. Instead, she lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and said, "We thought the worst part of that night was the scream. But it wasn't. It was the silence after." No one argued. Because they all remembered it now. The scream had come from the woods, not the water, and it hadn't belonged to Bobby. It had been a girl's voice. High, sharp, terrified. And they had never spoken of it again. In the morning, they packed into Iris's old Buick and drove north to Ashbury, a small town wrapped in fog and old brick buildings that looked like they held too many secrets. St. Luke sat on the hill like an institution out of time, where the grass grew too evenly and the windows never opened. Inside, a nurse named Janine met them with the kind of professional calm reserved for people walking into situations that were about to come undone. "I'm sorry, but Frances Montgomery isn't accepting visitors," she said, glancing at her clipboard like it might offer a way out. "But she did leave something for you, just in case you showed up." From behind the counter, she handed Iris a manila envelope, thick and weighty, sealed with wax. Frances's idea of drama hadn't changed even in the shadows of madness. Maeve took the envelope this time, broke the seal, and pulled out a cassette tape. No label. Just a blank tape, heavy with whatever truth it carried. Back at the house, they had to dig out an old tape deck from the attic, wipe off the dust, and pray it still worked. The static crackled first, then came Frances's voice, older than they remembered, but clear, strong, and unmistakably hers. "If you're hearing this, then you've all done what I asked, and I'm sorry for that." The recording began, and all four women leaned in, as if the past might whisper the answer they'd never dared speak aloud. "I didn't fake my death, not exactly," Frances continued, "but I needed you to think I was gone. I needed you back in that house. Together." The air thickened as the tape whirred on. "I needed you to see what I saw. To feel what I felt. To understand what I never said. Bobby didn't drown by accident. Someone pushed him." The room went still. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. Lolly gasped, Judith closed her eyes, and Iris sat frozen, cigarette burning down to the filter between her fingers. Frances's voice continued, unwavering, almost gentle now. "And I think I know who. But I need you to figure it out for yourselves. Because until you do, you'll never be free of that night." The tape clicked off. Silence filled the room like water rising fast. Lolly, voice barely a whisper, asked, "Do you believe her? That one of us?" And Judith, eyes sharp now, her judge's mask back in place, answered with a question of her own, one none of them expected. "Do any of you remember what happened to Grace Halpern that same summer?" "She vanished," Maeve said quietly, but her voice was steady, like a woman who'd finally decided she wasn't afraid of memory anymore. "1 week after Bobby disappeared, Grace Halpern walked out of Sunday service and was never seen again, not by her parents, not by anyone." Judith didn't blink, just tapped her fingers on the armrest of her chair like a slow, deliberate metronome, timing the unraveling of the truth. 2 disappearances, same summer, same circle of friends. And no one in this room thought to ask if they were connected? Lolly crossed herself again, but this time the motion looked automatic, like a habit clinging to someone whose faith had long since cracked. "I remember she wore yellow that day," she whispered, eyes glazed over like she was staring through time instead of the parlor window. "Bright yellow, like a daisy. Said she was going to meet someone. Said it was a secret." Iris stood slowly, walked to the fireplace, and pulled down the old yearbook that had sat there untouched for decades. Frances had always left it out, spine cracked, pages dog-eared. She flipped to the class photo section, and there was Grace Halpern, front row, smiling wide, her eyes bright, her hair caught mid-bounce like she was turning toward a laugh. Iris stared at that picture like it might blink or speak or give her back a sliver of the truth she hadn't known she'd forgotten. Then her hand stopped on the next page. There, right below the picture of Bobby Martin, was a scrawled note in pen that hadn't been there before. It wasn't printed, and it wasn't in Frances's handwriting. Just 5 words, shaky but legible, ink pressed hard into the paper. She knew what he did. Maeve saw it first, came up behind Iris and leaned in close enough to smell the faint trace of old perfume clinging to the pages. She knew, she whispered, voice full of gravel and smoke. That's why she disappeared. Or someone made sure she did. No one spoke for a long time. The truth had been inching toward them for days, like a storm you pretend might pass but already feel in your bones. But now, it was here. They weren't just revisiting an old grief, they were peeling back layers of something far worse. 2 disappearances, 1 summer, and 4 women with a hole in their memory that looked more and more like a choice. Judith stood abruptly, went to the trunk again, and pulled out the one folder none of them had touched, the one marked only with a question mark. Inside, they found photographs, not from their youth, but recent. Pictures taken from across streets, through windows, in public parks. Pictures of them. Maeve at her studio, covered in ink and charcoal. Lolly leaving a church, looking over her shoulder. Judith outside her courthouse. Iris at her grocery store, keys in hand, unaware of the camera across the lot. Each photo was dated within the last year. All of them. Someone had been watching. Following. Waiting. And at the bottom of the stack was one more envelope, different from the others, sealed in clear plastic, like evidence. Inside, a cassette tape. Another recording. They slid it into the deck, and Frances's voice returned, more fragile this time, like a woman standing at the edge of something deep. I know who pushed him, she said. I've always known. But knowing isn't the same as understanding why. I hoped bringing you all together might show me what I missed. A pause. A breath. Then her voice softened into something they hadn't heard since high school, when secrets were whispered under bleachers and promises were carved into trees. There was another person there that night, Frances continued. Someone none of us talked about. Someone who saw it happen. And she tried to stop it. Judith slammed the stop button before the tape could finish, her voice shaking now for the first time. I remember now, she said. Not everything, but enough. They all turned to her at once, a wave of emotion rising like floodwater behind their faces. She ran out from the woods when Bobby fell. She screamed. That was the scream we heard. It wasn't Iris. It wasn't Maeve. It was Grace. Lolly covered her mouth, eyes filling with tears that trembled but didn't fall. She saw it, she whispered. She saw one of us push him. No one moved. Because they each understood the unspoken truth, if Grace had seen it, and if Grace had vanished days later, then whoever pushed Bobby had reason to silence her too. Maeve stepped back, her jaw tight, voice brittle. Iris, she said slowly, carefully, do you remember who you were arguing with before he went into the lake? And Iris, barely breathing, barely standing, stared into the fire that wasn't burning and asked. What if it wasn't one of us? It was one of us, Judith said quietly, but without hesitation, like someone stepping into cold water because they finally stopped fearing the shock. It was Frances. The room cracked open with that one sentence. It wasn't thunder or screaming or even disbelief, it was silence again, but this time it screamed louder than anything they'd ever heard. Maeve took a single step back, as if the words themselves had physical force, and her face twisted into something between shock and fury, the kind she hadn't felt since the night she left town. Lolly's hand tightened so hard around the crucifix on her neck that the metal left a red imprint in her skin, but she didn't speak, couldn't speak. Iris reached for the edge of the table to keep from falling, because somewhere deep inside her, the truth had already been waiting, coiled and quiet, like a snake under floorboards. Judith turned toward the others, eyes clear now, her years on the bench lending weight to her words as though she were delivering her final verdict. I remember Frances being there, she said. She wasn't supposed to be, but she followed us to the lake that night. None of us saw her until it was too late. Maeve's voice cracked like dry wood as she whispered, but why? What was she doing out there? And Judith, without pause, said, she was in love with Bobby. Always was. Even when he was with Iris. Especially then. Iris felt the floor tilt under her as pieces began clicking together in her mind, not memories exactly, but the shape of absence, the outlines of things she had refused to question for decades. There had been glances. Moments. A journal she found once in Frances's closet filled with hearts and initials and poetry too breathless to be just fantasy. And that last argument, right before the lake, Bobby had told Iris he had made a mistake. He hadn't meant her. He meant Frances. Maeve was pacing now, breathing like a runner who saw the finish line and hated what lay beyond it. "So Frances pushed him?" she asked, voice rising with the old fire that had once made her unforgettable in every hallway of their youth. "She killed him because he didn't choose her." Judith shook her head slowly, with the gravity of someone who had spent too long turning over the details in her sleep. "She didn't mean to. I don't think she even knew what she was doing. She just wanted to stop him." He turned to go after Iris, and Frances ran forward, tried to grab him. He slipped. He hit the dock. The words hung in the air like smoke. Heavy. Suffocating. Final. "She ran when he hit the water," Judith added. "She screamed, but none of us saw her. We just saw the splash. We thought it was Iris." Lolly closed her eyes, whispering prayers now, words old and desperate and unfamiliar even to her. "She told me once," she whispered, years later, in a letter I never answered. "Said she tried to tell someone. But she was afraid." Maeve leaned against the wall, tears running down her cheeks in silence, not for Bobby, not even for Frances, but for the years they'd all lost to a truth buried too deep. "She watched us take the blame," she whispered. "All these years, she let us wonder if it was one of us." Iris finally spoke, her voice soft but steady, the strength of a woman who had endured cancer, divorce, and loss, and was still standing. "She didn't do it to hurt us," she said. "She did it because she couldn't carry it alone anymore." They sat in silence for a long time, watching the light shift across the walls as the past settled into place. Then Iris stood, walked to her untouched folder on the floor, and opened it. Inside, one photograph. A picture of her and Frances, taken the summer before everything shattered, arms around each other, young and golden and full of dreams too big for their small town. On the back, in Frances's neat handwriting, were the final words she'd ever send. "I'm sorry I let him fall. I'm sorry I let us all fall. But I needed you to come back, not for the house. For me." They drove to Ashbury that night. No debate. No fear. Just four women in an old car with nothing left to run from. Frances was waiting in a quiet room, her eyes dull with years but still holding the fire of the girl they once knew. When she saw them, her face didn't break, it melted, like a candle long unlit suddenly flickering back to life. No words. Just four hands on hers. Four hearts forgiving. And when they walked out of that room, they left behind a secret that had ruled their lives, but not their futures. Back at the house, Iris stood on the porch at sunrise, cigarette in hand, watching light fill the cracks of the old wood. Maeve joined her, then Judith, then Lolly, each bringing their own silence like a peace offering. And Iris said the only thing that needed saying. "We thought this place was where everything ended. Turns out, it's where we begin." Write in the comments where you're from, let's see how far these stories can spread. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. See you soon.